Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan M. Espis, Ukraine War News Update, second part thereof for the 14th of March 2025, and we've got a lot of geopolitical stuff to get through. As you can see, a huge number of tabs, and that's not even going on to the second group of tabs, so a lot to talk about. We're actually going to continue from my earlier video today, talking about hits and losses. I forgot to share this with you. I actually hadn't looked at what Paul Sweeney had sent me. And he sends me often the firms data for explosions that are going on or heat signatures, intense heat signatures. And this, I presume, is a sort of time-lapse version. I'm not 100% sure. I would have thought that isn't all taking place at the same time. But you can see overnight that there was fires around. That's Odessa. So this is the Black Sea here. You've got Crimea there. So a single fire in what looks like Sevastopol area there. Or maybe that's Simferopol, I don't know. Anyway, you've got the gas rigs out in the Black Sea, and then you've got the Dnipro River, so around there, the estuary there. You have Odessa, some serious activity taking place there. And then, yep, you can see at the edge of the Black Sea, I think that's probably, is that Tuapse? I'm not sure, the oil refinery on the edge of the Black Sea where that was hit last night. And then Krasnodar Krai, a lot of places around there. Then occupied Ukraine, a lot of places there. And then Saratov Engels Air Base around there. I'm pretty sure that's where that is, if my geography is correct. Interesting, there's a lot of places near the Caspian Sea. Some of these, I don't know, they could be just either like naturally occurring fires, if you like, or not war connected. But I wonder whether heat signatures from I don't know, industrial output, or I'm not sure. But there are lots of fires going on all over the shop that you can see. So a lot of activity over last night, and we often just report what comes out in the socials, and there might be an awful lot more that's taking place beneath the radar, and I guess this gives an indication of that. So the Ukrainians might well have been firing all sorts of munitions into Russia, and we only hear about a few of them. But take that all with a pinch of salt, etc., etc. Right. Let's go on to the geopolitical news, and there is a lot. Russian oil prices continue to fall, say Reuters. Urals fell to $54 a barrel. This is great. Anything under $60, I think, is a boon for Ukraine, and because it's a real issue for the Russians, compared to with mid-January when Urals were shipped to the Baltic at $70 and more per barrel. Russian oil has fallen by 23%. There is very little left to the critical level of Urals from the budget point of view. $50 per barrel, with oil below $60. According to the budget rule, Russia will spend the so-called National Welfare Fund to cover the deficit. That's what I was saying. So $60 is your key figure there. If it drops below that, then they're essentially making a loss and they're having to dip into their National Welfare Fund. However, there is less free money left in the fund than ever before since its creation in 2008, 37.5 billion in Chinese yuan and gold. With the oil price down to $50 per barrel, the National Welfare Fund will last for a year. And this is, Trump knows about hurting Russia with low oil prices, although that's more of a collateral of just having generally low oil prices. That's what Trump wants for inflationary reasons, and that's understandable. But the added benefit, he wouldn't lower oil prices because it hurts Russia. He's like, yeah, this is how we can hurt them. But obviously the main impetus there is for his own economic well-being, and that, again, that's understandable. Gazprom prepares mass layoffs and property sales due to losses, and I assume this is going to be somewhat connected to well, actually, no, that's not oil. That's Gazprom. So this is not this. It's the issues that the Russians are having with hydrocarbons, and maybe the supply to Europe through the Druzhba pipeline, which keeps getting hammered. The issues with pipes going through Ukraine that have been turned off. So Gazprom not making the money they need to make, and preparing to make mass layoffs again, because that's already happened previously. Gazprom's export to Europe have fallen by more than 90%. Wow. So that is obviously going to have a huge impact. Just to let you know, the Austrian foreign minister has visited Kiev. Now, this is, I think, important because there's a new government that's been formed. That is not the far-right FPO. under Kikl. They've been trying desperately to avoid a coalition of the FPO and someone else, and it ended up with no one else being willing to go into partnership with Kikl's FPO, which is, I think, good for European unity and centrist politics in Austria. However, that might build a bubbling resentment with the people who did vote for FPO being frustrated by them not getting to power, and then they might generate a momentum there to really become more popular as time goes forward. It depends how well the coalition government do in Austria, but they are functioning now at least, and good to see them involved in Ukrainian politics. Okay, army chiefs from 30 plus nations met in Paris, this was the other day, to discuss a European-led security force in Ukraine after a ceasefire. France and the UK leading. Options include deploying troops at key sites, air and naval support, and rapid response strikes if Russia violates peace. And in fact, we are learning that there are some 15 countries that are up for providing that kind of assistance. I don't know the finer details of that and exactly what each country is prepared to do, but that's a pretty good coalition of the willing there. In terms of, there are coalitions that are willing in terms of, like, we're prepared to help Ukraine by ramping up defense expenditure and building more stuff and sending stuff to Ukraine and giving money to Ukraine. That's one thing. And the other thing is sending peacekeepers to Ukraine. So you're going to have a larger coalition of willing in terms of supporting Ukraine more generally, and then a smaller coalition of willing in terms of getting peacekeepers on the ground or in the air or in the sea in Ukraine. So, and that's really good news. And indeed, Keir Starmer is heavily involved in this, and he will be hosting a meeting tomorrow, Saturday, a virtual meeting of, I think, is it defense leaders? But so that's all good. It's good to see that Ukraine is getting the support from Europe, because when Trump said Ukraine has no cards, it's clear that Ukraine does have cards, right? It's got its own defense industry that is building stuff at greater and greater capacities with each passing month. And it has asymmetries on the battlefield, like in terms of, say, drone manufacturing, very much so. In fact, the US has gone to, as I reported yesterday, gone to Ukraine to ask for assistance with certain technologies and to ask for assistance with drone manufacturing. So there are asymmetries on the battlefield that Ukraine has, you know, where they have advantages over the Russians. Those are cards that the Ukrainians have. Right, and they have the Europeans. It's a major card, and I think that's really frustrating for Trump. Trump would like to see a capitulating Ukraine that brings this war to a very quick close. He doesn't care about justice for Ukraine. He doesn't care about just peace. He wants a quick peace, which means he can open up trade routes with Russia, open up hydrocarbons industry, get American businesses in to get rare earth minerals from Russia and hydrocarbon extraction, etc., etc. That's what he wants. Europe is frustrating him in that. And so this is a major card that the Ukrainians have. They have the support of a fairly united Europe, and that includes a larger support, as mentioned, and a peacekeeping force support too. So there are cards that the Ukrainians have, of course. The EU Parliament accuses the US, as I mentioned yesterday, of blackmailing Ukraine in a joint declaration. That declaration accuses the US of trying to negotiate a ceasefire and peace agreement with Russia over the heads of Ukraine and other European states. And we're going to return to this idea later, because it's quite difficult to work out where the US really sit with regard to Ukraine, because all their rhetoric appears to suggest they're supportive of Russia, yet Russia is frustrating the Americans here. As Europe is frustrating the Americans, Russia is frustrating the Americans with not being inclined to do a quick ceasefire and therefore bring about a quick peace deal. So how do the Americans deal with that? Do they take that back to the Russians and say, that's your fault, and therefore we're going to really come down hard on the Russians in terms of sanctions and military aid to Ukraine? Or do they switch that around and take it back to the Ukrainians and say, look, this is what the Russians want, why aren't you giving them everything they want? It's your fault that there's not a ceasefire, and come down heavily on Ukraine. And we're yet to see exactly what Trump has in mind here. But the Europeans, there does seem to be this, again, continued divergence away from the US. as we are entering a time of some pretty heavy trade war. Trump yesterday, rhetorically, was absolutely insulting about the EU. He lied about the EU again, lied about why it was created. And then there's this growing trade war on certain sectors of the economy. And he's got this growing trade war with Canada. And he also almost joked with Mark Rutte from NATO about annexing. He didn't deny he's going to annex. In fact, he said it's likely to happen, didn't he? Was the answer to, are you going to annex Greenland? There's insanity going on in the corridors of power in the United States. And they seem to be far more, or Trump seems, and his team seem to be far more focused on attacking friends than being hard on enemies, something we'll return to later. So in that context, it's very important to see how the EU is acting. And the EU have no plans to lift sanctions on Russia, whereas the Americans are talking about wanting to do that. On the contrary, a new package is in the works, says EU Foreign Affairs says their spokesperson, goodness, Anita Hipper. The bloc is also working to extend existing sanctions, but Hungary continues to block the decision at this moment. Well, that was the initial claim. Hungary were threatening to cancel the sanctions on 2,000 Russians unless the EU exempted Mikhail Friedman. It is clear that Orban is no longer acting in good faith and Hungary's voting rights in the EU have been suspended. Have to be suspended, says Bill Browder. Then we hear that actually they did extend the sanctions on the Russian oligarchs after Hungary dropped its opposition. So I presume there was some arrangement there, some compromise to a degree. Hungary had pushed to delist 8 individuals, but backed down after negotiations. Billionaire Mikhail Friedman remained sanctions. He was someone that was mentioned yesterday in my live interview with Zarina Zabriskie, which is really worth looking at about how Trump is compromised. Ursula von der Leyen then released a statement. The EU increases pressure on on Russia. We extend our sanctions on nearly 2,400 individuals and entities over Russia's ongoing aggression against Ukraine, including travel bans, asset freezes, bans on funding and resources. Our determination to support Ukraine is decisive. Really strong from the EU against Russia. Do we see that from the US? They could do that. This is a major tool that they have for leverage over Russia. Is Trump prepared to use that? We have heard from some Trump individuals like Scott Bessent, we'll see that later, saying that this is something that could well happen. But we're yet to see that. This is great from von der Leyen, says Tim White, and we really appreciate the work done and results achieved, but shouldn't we also tell everyone that this was only possible by giving into Hungary again? Orban got Russia's sports minister, some businessmen, and the sister of an oligarch all removed. Yep, but then it seems that it wasn't a huge set of compromises. So unfortunately, that's the way it goes with a kind of unanimity decision process inside the EU. Something does need to be done about Orban. I was listening to... Who was it? Was it The Rest is Politics as Alistair Campbell and Rory Stewart? I think it was Rory Stewart saying, or maybe Campbell, that they were speaking to some EU dignitaries the other day. And there is this growing sense that something proper has to be done about Hungary, not just in the terms of we've got to do something about Hungary, but actually that I think things are being put in place. That kind of threat that starts materializing in tangible ways could then get Hungary to start panicking, because actually outside the EU, they are going to lose a lot of money, right? They are not a net contributor to the EU, and they need the EU. And if you start really threatening Hungary, they might start falling into line. And it's interesting to see that the polls are not looking good for Fidesz in a really tangible way. This is a 9% lead. That's a huge lead for this upstart Tiadza party. Fidesz down on 37%, Peter Magyar's party on 46%. We could be witnessing, says Daniel Freund, who is, I think, a German Green MEP. Is that correct? In fact, I can probably tell by just hovering over his name. German member of parliament. I think he's Green Party. Anyway, we could be witnessing the beginning of the end of the Orban rule in Hungary, with the newest poll showing from the most trusted polling institution in Hungary, a big old lead for the new upstart party. What I worry about, as I've said many times before, is that like we see in many places around the world, and like we've seen with Orban himself and his Fidesz party, when you want to cling on to power, you will remove all the checks and balances. And you will start putting in place things that will allow you to rig the election, even though they're in the EU. I mean, what you've got to hope is the EU have enough power over Hungary to stop that from happening, enough oversight to stop that from happening. But that is a very real worry, as we've already seen Hungary democratically backslide. Now, interesting that Serbian students have been heading out again, or continually actually, recently. Here they're in Belgrade for what's expected to be the largest anti-government demonstration since the Milosevic overthrow. That was on the 13th. That was yesterday, I presume from the night before. So I wonder whether there will be a lot of pressure on Vucic to turn things around and change the direction of travel there, as they seem to have a foot on both sides of the fence. But I think Vucic is much more favouring a kind of ultra-nationalist, pro-Russian approach, while saying just about enough to keep the EU happy. They're not in the EU, Serbia, but they have these. They've been long on the journey towards accession to the EU, but that journey seems to be going at a snail's pace because Vucic isn't really that interested in joining. Right, the UK. A few bits on the UK now. Sorry to be a bit UK-centric here. So we have withdrawn accreditation from Russian diplomats in a tit-for-tat move, because if you remember, the Russians kicked out a couple of diplomats from Moscow, follows Russia throwing out 2 embassy staff the other day, which in turn followed the guilty verdicts for Russian spies operating from Norfolk in the UK. The Russian ambassador was summoned and warned of increasing intimidation of its staff in Russia. And then we have seen the UK deciding to withdraw the accreditation of a Russian diplomat in response to a similar move by Moscow earlier this week against a British representative. A spokesperson for the UK Foreign Ministry stated that Russia's actions are aimed at closing the British embassy in Moscow, which could have dangerous consequences. So that has happened. David Cameron, a former Prime Minister, has stated that he worries Trump's Ukraine strategy might validate Russian regional dominance, potentially endangering Baltic nations despite their NATO membership. Trump's Ukraine stance is worrying for Russia's neighbour, says David Cameron. So he's speaking up against Trump's direction of travel there. And talking about what's been going on with Trump and the peace negotiations, since the Oval Office fracas that happened, goodness knows, was that 10 days ago now, something like that? Keir Starmer's diplomatic heavyweight, Jonathan Pwell, has been working hard, apparently, to repair the Trump-Zelensky relations. I actually said this yesterday. I read a few things, and there seems to be more coming out about this. He's helped Ukraine and the US draft a ceasefire proposal, fostering communication after a difficult Trump-Zelensky meeting. Indeed, Alex Wickham here says the UK was heavily involved behind the scenes ahead of the US-Ukraine talks in Saudi Arabia, according to British sources. Jonathan Pwell worked with Mike Waltz and his French and German counterparts on a plan for a truce to begin a peace process. At the weekend, Pwell met with Zelensky and Yermak in Kiev. They produced a written proposal for the staged process to bridge the gap with the US. It's based on a ceasefire, confidence-building measures, including for an exchange of POWs, a release of detained civilians, return of children, then negotiations to bring about a just and lasting peace. A detailed text was agreed with both the US and Ukrainian sides. Rubio will debrief G7 foreign ministers in Canada. Powell will be in DC on Friday with European colleagues to meet Waltz. Starmer will convene European and NATO leaders on Saturday. The ball is now in Russia's court, a UK source says. Quote, now Ukraine has made a concrete offer of a ceasefire. The ball is firmly in the Russian court. Will they reciprocate and stop the fighting to allow serious negotiations on a lasting peace, or will they continue to slaughter innocent civilians? Jonathan Pwell was big. What was he? Was he not in the Blair government doing sort of similar things? This is the UK doing, I think, what the UK can do quite well, which is mediate it seriously and help. And it might be because of UK's historic position in the world. It might be because English, we're lucky, I've talked about this previously, that the UK has oversized power in the world, partly because we have the international language. Like, English is the international language. So when it comes to talking to the rest of the world, it's a lot easier for us to do so because we speak English. Like, honestly, stuff like that. So when you see some really interesting analysis I've read to you or talked about, I don't know, maybe a year and a half ago, where they're saying when you have a British, this is when I was talking about, you need someone in Europe that can galvanize European support. You need a leader that you can stand behind. But it just so happens that it's easier if that leader is English, because when they stand up and speak, you hear them in English. No one really translates what they say. Whereas if you've got a German leader that stands up and they're going to be speaking German, then that has to be translated, and you miss a lot of the nuance and the strength of the rhetoric, etc., etc. And so there is just a natural advantage that English and American people have, or strong English speakers have, when it comes to international diplomacy and communication. When you're communicating to the outside world, if you can do it in really good English, then you've got an advantage, because a lot of places won't need to translate that. But if you're speaking another language, that has to go through a translator, and you lose so much of the rhetorical strength of what's being said, and therefore that person doesn't seem as charismatic, or even though they might be being absolutely on point in their original language. So there are advantages that the UK just naturally has because we speak English. Discuss. Okay. A worrying insight from a retired British Army officer who was NATO's Deputy Supreme Commander of Europe. So this is on Channel 4. I'm actually going to play this. It's quite a long clip. Excuse me for playing this. 3 minutes 50.
Well, Sir Richard Sheriff is a retired British Army officer who was NATO's Deputy Supreme Commander Europe from 2011 to 2014, and he joins me now from Salisbury. Good evening. In the last few days, you've been extremely critical of Donald Trump. I think you wrote an article saying it was worse than appeasement of Nazi Germany, the way he was behaving. But it now appears that Ukraine and Europe and Britain are all going along with it. Are they wrong?
I think the ceasefire, and this is a Ukrainian proposal, the Ukrainians have accepted the proposal for ceasefire. So this is a clever move, I think, by President Zelensky, designed to force a moment of clarity. If Russia refuses, the illusion of diplomacy collapses. If Russia accepts the ceasefire, then the real test begins. The question is whether and when Washington will recognize when Russia inevitably breaks that ceasefire, as it absolutely certainly will, because nothing can trust Russia. And that will allow Russia once again to dictate the terms of reality to President Trump and the rest of the American regime.
And so would that be your view of any peace deal that were to come out of this ceasefire, if it were to happen? There's a lot of ifs there, I accept. But do you think Russia would always end up breaking any peace?
Absolutely, no question about it. It'll manufacture an excuse, it'll stage an attack, it'll flood the information space with fabricated so-called evidence that Ukraine has violated the deal, it'll claim victimhood, it'll weaponize diplomacy. Russia cannot be trusted because, and this is in a sense the night.
And this is someone that knows Russia, right? I mean, we all know this. We've seen this over time. We might not know in great detail, but Sheriff will know this in detail by being involved with NATO and the British Armed Forces and knowing very well what the Russians do time and time and time again. And we don't hear enough of this rhetoric coming from the Americans because they've taken this position of not being pro-Ukraine, but being supposed neutral mediators, but actually really taking the side of Russia. And we'll come to this in a second with something that Dmytro Kuleba has said of late. But anyway, I think he's absolutely on point in predicting the activities of the Russians here.
Naivety of the White House that Russia has only ever been an empire. If Russia listened to that young 18-year-old recruit wearing a black balaclava talking to your interviewer, they would understand that Russia is an imperial state that will never stop until it has dismembered Ukraine, brought it back under the Russian Empire, removed it from the map as a sovereign state. And the only thing that is going to force Russia to stop is if Russia is firmly stopped and defeated. And that clearly, right now, is not on the cards. So this peace deal, most likely, if it happens, is going to allow Putin to declare victory and to stage another attack when he's ready. And then we're back in the business again.
Indeed. Well, the idea of Russian defeat, as you say, is off the table. But European defense chiefs have been meeting in the last couple of days to talk about what they can do to support Ukraine. Now, Russia is very, very clear. It will not accept NATO forces on its border in Ukraine. So what do these talks amount to? I mean, are we pivoting to a policy instead of how the outside world gives weaponry and resource to the Ukraine army to defend itself?
With America having declared effectively that it's in bed with Putin, and giving.
So for Sir Richard Sheriff to say this, like, that is a massive, massive declaration from a serious senior UK military man that the Trump administration is in bed with Russia.
President Zelensky, the disgraceful hard time it did a couple of weeks ago. Europe, the only hope, frankly, for Ukraine now is for Europe to step up. And it's great that the European defense ministers are meeting as they are. Europe has got a deep.
And I'm going to add a few things to that I'm just seeing pop up now. Germany potentially close to a breakthrough on the debt brake, although annoyingly a lot of that debt brake is going to be put to, from our point of view at least, to raising money for German infrastructure, but it should give the ability to spend for the Germans to spend a lot more on defence. And then EU's defence plans are taking shape according to an analysis. So they really are coming together with a concrete plan to act as a central purchasing body on behalf of EU member states. That's the European Commission. It will, so quote here, Europe cannot take the US security guarantees for granted and must substantially step up its contribution to preserve NATO, a strong NATO, states a draft seen by The Guardian. A revanchist Russia is the immediate military threat to the EU. Over-reliance on EU-S protection has impaired Europe's ability to defend itself and its autonomy to act in its own neighbourhood. So they are putting things together in really substantial ways.
Deep, make sacrifices, and really give Ukraine the means to not only survive, but to thrive. And then longer term, on the assumption that America will not back NATO in the way that it has for 76 years, now start looking at how Europe and Canada, of course, fills the gap.
Yeah, and you could add Japan and Australia and New Zealand to that as well, perhaps. Also hearing that G7 is warning Russia of further sanctions if no ceasefire is agreed. That's interesting. Canada being the rotating president of the G7 at the moment, I wonder what the US is saying about that, because the US has still been refusing to agree to a statement on Russia, that admitting that they're the aggressor, etc., and they want to calm down the G7 rhetoric, even though it's perfectly accurate what the G7 is trying to say outside of the US. So I guess we'll wait to see how that turns out. Now, I thought that was absolutely on point by Sir Richard Sheriff there. I think Jonathan Finker's had an interview with Sir Richard Sheriff, so he's a big hitter. Just to give you some other context of what is happening, Trump has ordered, as we know, 25% tariffs on European and UK and anyone else's steel imports to the US without exemption. The industry body UK Steel said it's a sledgehammer which could threaten steel exports from Britain worth around £400 million a year. So we are in trouble economically anyway, and this is really going to hurt us. And it's also worth noting that a couple of times, not last night, the night before, the UK government came out and said, well, we can't retaliate. We're just not strong enough to retaliate. And here is where, and I talked about this a little bit yesterday, the EU are going to retaliate, and they're involved in this big trade war with the US. The UK doesn't have the strength to retaliate because we are now a minnow outside of the EU compared to the US and the EU. So us on our own having a trade war with the US, we are going to lose that. However, Canada seems to be a lot stronger on that. But then Canada has huge natural resources that they can use as leverage in a way that the UK can't, and they're much closer geographically to the US. But I think it's interesting. There's a lot of people saying, this is a good indication that Brexit has harmed us because we just have to sit there and take it when the US whacks tariffs on us. So it doesn't look like there are any retaliations coming from the UK in terms of that. But having a trade war at the same time as we're trying to navigate the tricky waters of the Ukraine war with Russia is insanity. But of course, that's what the US is doing, just at a time when we need maximum unity, at a time when we need to come together to support Ukraine in unity against Russia. You've got the US starting on all of their allies. We're going to talk about the insane things going on with Panama, potentially. We've got Canada, we've got Greenland and Denmark, we've got the EU, we've got UK, we've got trade wars with all the allies, and Australia you can include with that, with aluminium and steel. It's just crazy times. Polish president has urged, so this is Andrzej Duda. You got to understand, Poland is very close to the US. It's one of the European states that is most aligned. The PIS, the Law and Justice Party, has spent a lot of time getting cozy with American conservatism. I almost wrote an article, what was it, 2 years ago? I wanted to write an article, a feature piece for Only Sky, which is a non-religious media organisation. It's now unfortunately run out of funding, but there's a different iteration of it. But the article I wanted to write was looking at how the church and education institutions like religious universities in Poland were being used in ways that you can see in America to try and influence politicians going into governance, etc., etc. And there was a real interesting parallel there, and the Polish were taking a leaf out of the American books, etc., etc. And anyway, it was going to be quite a niche article, but Poland and the US have been very, very close, particularly in the conservative world. And so Andrzej Duda, as a president who is a member of the PIS, is in a unique position to, and this is why he was kind of sent to the White House to try and get Trump on side. But Trump is that kind of conservatism is very relevant in American politics still. But Trump is like a radical populist, where like he's so transactional that he that kind of thing doesn't appeal to him particularly. Anyway, he left Andrzej Duda waiting for an hour and a half, and the hour-long meeting only turned into a 10-minute meeting, and it was an absolute humiliation for Duda. And so here we have got Duda appealing to the US and saying, please deploy your nuclear weapons in Poland. Quote, Russia did not even hesitate when they were relocating their nuclear weapons to Belarus. So do us a favor, put your nukes here, and then that will be beneficial for Poland and for NATO. JD Vance has said he would be shocked if Trump agreed to station US nukes in Poland. And that seems to be a fairly strong rebuttal to the point where Edward Hunter Christie said, I used to think Poland was the most Trump-proof country in Europe. High defence spending as a percentage of GDP, so they spend above the US on defences as a percentage of GDP. Large US force presence in Poland. Cultural politics that Trumpists would like as far as PIS, that's the Law and Justice Party, is concerned. They were Trump 45 proof, as in Trump 1.0, but not Trump 47 proof. The new game is Europe alone. And so this is JD Vance responding to Polish president's proposal to redeploy American nuclear warheads to Poland. No, it's a no-go as far as he's concerned. Interesting dynamics, I think, developing there between the two nations, and maybe a divergence from sort of PIS conservatism. They are, like Europe is as a whole, diverging from US conservatism. Or, I just don't think the Trump administration gives a toss about Europe anymore in any way, shape or form, unless it's like AFD. And PIS are Eurosceptic, so this is another kind of connection that Duda and the PIS have with Trump. And Trump wants to, I think, undermine the EU And the PIS could be a way of doing that, but they seem to want to go even further than that and go to people like AFD and whatnot. Okay, Russia, China, and Iran have been holding naval drills in the Gulf of Oman. The exercises named Maritime Security Belt 2025 were held near the strategic Strait of Hormuz, a key global shipping route through which a fifth of the world's traded crude oil passes. And as some of you Australians keep telling me, Australia is becoming surrounded. China's warships encircle Australia. A flotilla of 3 Chinese Navy ships sailed around Australia for nearly a month, moving in and out of its exclusive economic zone, conducting live fire drills and forcing civilian flights to reroute. China's 2 warships had 144 missile launchers, while Australia's entire fleet of 10 warships had only 200. Australia's 2 fuel tankers, crucial for long-range operations, were out of commission. Australia's navy is old and dependent on the United States, according to the New York Times. Wow, this is China flexing, and say this is a statement to the US, a statement to AUKUS, statement to I guess allied presence in the Indo-Pacific region. China, like they're doing with Taiwan, are flexing big time. I just want to, as we're talking about maritime issues, many of you commented on the Russian captained, or the master of the ship of the Portuguese flagged vessel, the Solong, that sailed directly into the American flagged Stena Immaculate and smacked a hole in the side. There were all sorts of conspiracy theories and rumors flying about because he was Russian, the guy who was kind of in charge of that Portuguese vessel. Well, there are many of you that said, look, I'm an expert in X, Y, and Z concerning ships and blah, blah, blah. And thank you for that. That's exactly why that's why I love this channel. Just great variety of expertise, and saying, actually, it's looking like this was just, it's Hanlon's razor, isn't it? Is it Hanlon's razor? Don't put down to malice what can be better explained by cock up. And a lot of people saying actually it probably was a genuine mistake, albeit an absolutely insane one. But yeah, these things do happen. There should have been things in place to stop that from happening. They didn't, but it probably wasn't a conspiracy of sabotage. But you can never rule it out. Okay. Ukraine is ready to ratify the free trade agreement with Turkey. I'm including this because I think Ukraine is, very importantly so, getting closer to Turkey and realizing that Turkey, as a neighbor, is a very important nation in terms of determining the outcome of this war. He emphasized that Ukraine views Turkey as a strategic partner and a key player in security guarantees, 100%. And they're a nation who have agreed to put boots on the ground as well. Now, I'm including this just to give you a sense. I know there probably aren't very many of you now that still watch my channel who are really supportive of Trump. But when you've got people in Switzerland coming out and doing this, you know that Trump is universally unpopular. Well, largely unpopular outside of the US. So this is flipping the bird to Trump, where on the fingernail there with Trump's tie around the finger, this is clearly about Trump, and you have in Switzerland these people flipping the bird to Donald Trump there in a really significant manner. It's just incredible. So there you go. Look at all these people here as they're anyway, I just think it's quite indicative of people's feelings about the direction of travel for the American administration at the moment with regard to their distaste for anything European and anything allied, really. And as Richard Sheriff says, getting into bed with Putin. That's how people are feeling. Okay. This is Dmytro Kuleba, and I said I would refer to him a little later. So his quote is, "Not a single American official from the administration has said a word since January the 20th of this year that there is anything wrong with Russia, that there is at least one problem in Russia, that there is a difference in values between the US and Russia. So he's a former foreign minister of Ukraine, and he's absolutely right in saying there's not been one official, in these super important roles that has been remotely critical of Russia. And yet Russia are executing POWs continually, sending missiles and drones into civilian infrastructure, doing heinous things, and there's not been one bit of criticism in 7 weeks from the American administration. I think it's vile. I honestly think it's vile. Now, before we go on to talk about things to do with the peace deal and whatnot, things like this are passing under the radar at the moment, and this is quite serious. So, as this source says, I'm sorry, what the F? Hegseth, get your kid to reverse this crap right now. ONA, so I think that's someone speaking to Pete Hegseth's father. So get your kid to reverse this right now. ONA is literally the only department of the federal government that does long-term planning. There needs to be a congressional uproar over this. ONA is the reason we won the Cold War. What's he talking about? Well, the Pentagon shutters the storied Office of Net Assessment, the department's in-house think tank. The DoD says it's coming up with a plan to rebuild it in alignment with the department's strategic priorities, whatever that might mean. This is a bit of a worry. So 99% of Americans have never heard of ONA, but 100% of Americans have benefited from it. There is no logical reason to do this unless you are aiding your adversaries. What is going on here? Well, Washington, Pete Hegseth is de-establishing the Pentagon's Office of Net Assessment, a key office responsible for high-level strategic analysis, according to a memo obtained by Breaking Defense. The memo, dated yesterday, and signed by Hegseth, directs the Pentagon's Performance Improvement Officer and Director of Administration and Management to reassign all civilian employees to other mission-critical positions inside the department, while military personnel will return to their service to receive new billets. Simultaneously, the Pentagon's top acquisition official is directed to ensure that the necessary steps are taken by department contracting authorities to terminate, quote, all ONA contracts awarded for ONA and ONA-related requirements. A number of DC think tanks and research organisations will likely be impacted by these cancelled contracts. However, it appears ONA will live on in some manner, and this is the problem. So what you've got is this long-term strategic think tank within the DoD that's responsible for the outcome of the Cold War, effectively. The only long-term planning, strategic planning entity that there is, and they're getting rid of it and putting all those people into other jobs. What that means is that thinking will not maintain in whatever the new iteration of this will be. In other words, there is a whole new way about thinking about the future of the American position in the world that wants nothing to do with how America used to see itself. Like, that's the only reason you would get rid of all that expertise and say, well, we're going to rebuild it. It's not like you're going to take those people and change them, but get rid of some of you, but keep some of that expertise, and we're moving in a slightly different... No, this is you're all out and other people are going to come in because we've got a different idea of what we are wanting to be as a nation and our place, our role in the wider world. I advise you go and listen to my fascinating discussion with Edward Hunter Christie the other day, where we talk about this tripolar world that the US potentially wants, or the Trump administration wants, carving up the world. You know, it's the US and Russia and China together in this tripolar world, the EU not featuring, maybe being subservient to the US or carved up by the US and Russia. It's just incredible that this is happening. I remain concerned the ONA is not performing its mission for the taxpayer and has engaged in financial waste. Is what's thought. That's a Chuck Grassley, the Republican from Iowa, who is, it's the idea that this is part of the kind of Doge waste, whereas actually this is the center of strategic thought for the US. Going forward and in the past. Absolutely incredible. And So Anton Gerashenko says Trump's administration further restricts Russian access. So there have been these mixed messages coming out. One of them has been this, but I don't know. Been various things talked about this. I almost reported this 2 nights ago because this was out like 2 nights ago. That letter there. What's happening? Well, breaking. Trump had cut off all Russian oil sales to the EU. Treasury has ended the Biden exemption. So Biden had an sanction exemption that allowed sanctioned Russian banks to process European payments for oil sales. Because we are still so dependent in Europe on oil from Russia, there was exemptions so that we could wean ourselves off oil. And now that has lapsed and it hasn't been extended. Now, no one in Europe can purchase Russian oil. So there are people saying, on the one hand, this is amazing. Trump is doing a really good thing here to force Europe off Russian oil, and then, by extension, probably onto US LNG, etc., etc. There are other people saying there's a very high chance that this might have just not been re-signed, re-extended, because kind of it wasn't on a radar, like almost by mistake. Like there isn't that much agency going on here. There's different interpretations of what's going on here. I don't really know. Some people saying it isn't actually happening. Whatever. And that's why I didn't report it the other night, as I wanted to wait to see, and no one seemed to pick it up in the mainstream media because I saw this a couple of nights from like randos or whatever. But this is actually CBS News now saying Trump administration toughens sanctions on Russian oil, gas, and banking sectors. But I don't know 100% if this is actually Trump going out of his way to toughen sanctions or just this extension not being fulfilled and how much agency was behind that. But either way, this is good. I think it will force Europe's hand, and they might not like this if this has indeed happened. And it will mean that they will have to either find other ways to pay Russia for the hydrocarbons they're getting or not get hydrocarbons off Russia. So yeah, that is happening. Something like that is happening. Putin is afraid to tell Trump he wants to continue the war in Ukraine, says Zelensky. So Zelensky's view is that Putin's remarks about a 30-day ceasefire indicate he is preparing a rejection of the US proposal. The likelihood is, of course, like it appears right now, I think, that Russia will just string this out. Not say yes, not say no, just faff on about different elements of this that are essentially impossible, and then string along both the United States and Ukraine. And people are pretty cognizant that that is one of the most likely approaches, but it's what the US does in the knowledge that that's what Russia are doing. Now, interestingly, the ambassadors of Denmark and Germany were both spotted in Russia's foreign ministry yesterday. And this is when Witkoff was there as well. So the Europeans were there to some extent. Even Russian state media don't know the reason for the visit. It's usually to make them sit on a naughty step and receive a lecture from a fascist, says Tim White tongue-in-cheek. But with Witkoff in town, one does wonder. So there were some Europeans there. Now, as I reported earlier, Keith Kellogg has been, it seems, formally sidelined. And this might well be because Russia asked for the US to sideline Keith Kellogg, the envoy to Ukraine, because it didn't want him there at the peace talks because he's too close to Ukraine, not our kind of person, not of the caliber we are looking for. And as a result, the US has been beholden to what Russia have said and demanded, and capitulated to Russia's demands and sidelined Keith Kellogg. And I think that is a real reflection of where the American negotiating team are. Now, a ceasefire could happen within days if Russia does agree, says the US Secretary of State Marco Rubio. But, that word "if" is the operative word there. If they agree, but that's looking unlikely at the moment. The Trump administration will, without hesitation, impose the toughest sanctions against Russia, if necessary, to succeed in negotiations on a Ukrainian settlement, says Scott Bessent. But again, the operative word there is if, so if necessary. If we do, this is a threat, but it's not looking likely that the US would, I don't know, to be honest. That's what I keep saying, is that the US have a choice. Either they go hard on Ukraine or they go hard on Russia. And the form at the moment has been going hard on Ukraine. And they could take Russia's intransigence out on Ukraine by flipping that and saying, hang on, Ukraine, you need to do these things that Russia are demanding. Otherwise, we're going to punish you for this ceasefire not being agreed upon. Russia not agreeing to the ceasefire is actually Ukraine's fault for not fulfilling these maximalist demands. So it's going to be fascinating to see which way this goes. The threats are there from Scott Bessent, but how realistic are they? And I hope my skepticism is undue. I hope that actually the US really does go hard, and this is when you look back at this decision not to extend the Biden waiver, could be the US turning the screw on Russia. The White House won't confirm if it has mechanisms to enforce a ceasefire, though, with Russia. White House says the Kyiv Independent. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt declined to say whether or not the US has enforcement mechanisms in the event Russia violates a potential ceasefire when speaking to reporters on March the 12th. She's like every Trump White House press secretary, from Huckabee Sanders to Sean Spicer and Caroline Leavitt here. It's an impossible task, I think, anyway. But I really do not like Caroline Leavitt. Bad news for US democracy, I think. Now, but not all Republicans bad. Oh my goodness, am I going to heap some praise onto Mitch McConnell? Andrew Perpetua, how is it that Mitch McConnell is the only Republican left? He was interviewed recently, and here's a transcript of the interview, but you can go and see the video of it. He absolutely nails everything you need to know about Russia and the approach to Russia. I've heard that Ukraine needs to be prepared to do difficult things. I'm curious which difficult things our frontline partners haven't been doing for the past 3 years, like defending besieged towns and cities, like burying their sons and daughters. Will Russia be expected to do difficult things too, like ending its onslaught? By what means are we prepared to compel them? 100%. So, just to let you know that it's not just me being down on Republicans, it's me being down on people who are pro-Russia. Here, Mitch McConnell, who I've otherwise slagged off for the last 10 years, is absolutely on point. I'm not going to read it out now because it's far too long, but he's got everything right about Ukraine and Russia here. I'll reserve my skepticism, my disdain, and my condescension for the authoritarian thug who treats the slaughter of innocent children like a sport, and anyone who cares about not getting played for a sucker should do the same. In the face of our hesitation, Putin has escalated. He's insulted the sincere pursuit of peace. It's a crystal clear reminder and that what he's after isn't an end to the bloodshed. America cannot afford to get played, so let's not. Boom! Mitch McConnell, why are you not pulling the strings with regard to, of course, you're not Senate Majority Leader anymore, with regard to Ukraine? Now, where it gets particularly worrying, and some people are saying actually this isn't particularly unusual, but the fact that you would be gaming these situations is itself insane to me. The Trump White House has asked the US military to develop options for the Panama Canal. In other words, these are military options. In other words, we want you to put plans in place just in case we decide to invade Panama. Like that, you would be wargaming that. To me, just is reflective of how nuts geopolitics is at the moment. Potential plans range from partnering more closely with Panamanian security forces to a less likely option of US troops seizing the canal by force, US officials told NBC News. Just incredible. I won't go into details of that, but just wow. Now, I've already talked a lot about the US economics, and I'm not going to do that in great detail in this video, but I just want to let you know that the growing trade wars, like I said earlier, with allies almost entirely, yes, there is a set of tariffs on China, but some have been criticizing those tariffs aren't indeed particularly well thought through, whereas the tariffs on the rest of the world appear to be very, very closely thought through, and a lot of deliberations gone into them. This has then resulted in the stock market's tanking. And it's worth noting that stock markets are much more closely aligned to people's pockets, I think, in the US than in other places. Like, many more people have investments, I think. I don't know for sure, but I get the sense that the general public in America there are more people in America that invest in the stock market, and also 401ks. So people like track the stock markets much more closely with regard to their pensions, even though, pensions are connected to stocks and shares in the UK as well, and Europe, etc., etc. But Trump has there's some great montages at the moment about how Trump's been saying stock market is all about stock market, from Trump 1.0, and how amazingly important that is. And during Biden's administration, then it comes to the stock market absolutely tanking now. He's like, nothing to see here, nothing to see. Even though it was like the prime driver of his political success previously. Now it's tanking. It's either Biden's fault or it's, we're just resetting for a greater good. There's this kind of consequentialist moment here. Anyway, it is, however, definitely taking a toll on him, because he's waking up every day at the moment and shouting at the world. So he is like, this is what he said, one of his gazillion posts on True Social. The US doesn't have free trade. We have stupid trade. The entire world is ripping us off, all caps. He's literally like a madman shouting at the world, saying, I'm going to take you all on. Come here, like a drunk man in the street. Come here, anyone that walks past. I'll take you on. I'll have you in a fight. I'll take you on, mate. Come here, Doris. I'll punch you in the face for sure. That's what Trump seems to be like, where, unfortunately, all the people close to him that he's walking past, they're all his neighbours and people in his community, rather than people he should be starting to fight with or wary of, like Russia. Just incredible. Chief enemy in Trump's trade wars is reality, says Dr. Ian Garner. This is another one of the many Trump tirades. The globalist Wall Street Journal has no idea what they're doing or saying, and this was probably in response to a fascinating interview of the Wall Street Journal's chief editor, a British woman actually, who completely slagged off, and they keep slagging off actually Trump's trade war, calling it the dumbest trade war ever. But she was interviewed on Fox News by Maria Bartiromo, really going to town on Trump's trade war from a knowledgeable position. The globalist Wall Street Journal has no idea what they're doing or saying. They're owned by the polluted thinking of the European Union, which was formed for the primary purpose of screwing the United States of America. Their Wall Street Journal ! Thinking is antiquated and weak and very bad for the USA. But have no fear, we will win on everything. It's just shut up. We'll win on everything. Everything in the world. We're going to be the best at everything in the world. Really? I remember an American, nice guy, and I still know him on Facebook now, just got in touch again. But I was at Leeds University, and he spent a year with us at Leeds, and in the kind of halls of residence bar, we're all having a chat, and we're all talking about America, and we were young students, didn't really know, but we were maybe like critiquing American foreign policy or something like that. And he stood up, and this was in all seriousness. He said, "You guys, screw you guys. America are the best in the world at literally everything." And he genuinely believed that. And this guy is like, we are the best in the world at everything that you can think of in the world. We are the best at. And there you go. And I was like, at that moment, I was like, this is really interesting. As a young guy that I didn't really know much myself. But here was someone that was exporting this idea that the US are the leaders in the world at absolutely everything. Now, I'm sure you can make a good argument that they are at the forefront of many things in the world, right? But it's just that blithe belief that we're just winners at everything, which you can say is a really good thing to drive actual success on. But there's an element of this here. But have no fear, we will win on everything. Egg prices are down, they're not. Oil is down, it is. Interest rates are down, that's to try and get a handle on the inflation, which is up. And tariff-related money is pouring into the United States. I don't think it is. The only thing you have to fear is fear itself. But the point is that he is not only raining about everything, but he's also like this. This is someone saying exactly how much he's railing.
I shit you not. Tronald Dump has posted on Truth Social 132 times today. It might be a little bit off because ads popped up here and there. What is he doing? 132 posts today. Like 50 within a 2-hour time block. Is he working? Is he running the country? What is going on?
Of course, he's not writing them. That's his team. And there'll be different people writing different things, no doubt. And that's maybe why you get a different sense sometimes of what's actually going on in his head, because none of this is going on in his head. He's not writing these things. It's physically impossible for him to be both golfing and writing 50 Truth Social posts in a 2-hour period. He can't do that whilst holding the golf club. And lots of other worrying things. I'm going to talk about stuff like this, but this pertains to national security. I'll talk about this in other videos. But White House has ordered a halt on FBI background checks. You know, just wondering if you might be Russian at all. We're going to halt background checks for dozens of top staffers. Because, and apparently, it doesn't say here, but I think in the article, the reasoning given is because it's too intrusive. They're supposed to be intrusive. Literally, an FBI background check should be intrusive. They should intrude upon your personal life to make sure that you are safe to be in the Federal Bureau of Investigation, to see that you are not compromised by forces that are not beneficial to the United States objectives. Of course they should be intrusive. Oh, we're gonna stop. Why would you stop background checks? The only reason you would stop them is if you wanted people to be in positions who were compromised. Like, there is what are you doing? It's absolute insanity. Anyway, that's enough from me. Just honestly, I shake my head. SMH, shake my head. Right, just to remind you that there is a petition that I think you should all sign if you haven't already. I will link it below. Please, there are not nearly enough signatures on this. A mere 362 at the moment, when there should be 362,000. United Nations, table this resolution to expel Russia. It can't be vetoed. We need to get this talked about much more. Russia should not be sitting on the United Nations Security Council. So I interviewed Talaria about this. You can go and check out our interview there. It's actually linked in the description here, but that change.org petition will be linked in the description below. Please sign up to it. Take care, guys. I'll speak to you soon. Toodle pips.